September 17, 1944. 7 o'clock in the morning. British 1st Airborne Headquarters, Arnhem. The room was crowded and quiet. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stood at the center, flanked by his senior staff. Around him were officers from the British Airborne Corps and a delegation of American airborne commanders. Maps covered the tables. Red lines marked rivers. Bridges were circled in pencil. The plan was no longer theoretical. It was being activated. Montgomery issued the orders without hesitation. 3 Allied airborne divisions would be committed in a single operation. They would drop deep into the Netherlands to seize a chain of bridges stretching north toward Arnhem. British armor would then advance 62 miles along one narrow highway to link up with them. The airborne troops would hold until relief arrived. The armored column would be the only lifeline. The objective was explicit: a rapid thrust into Germany, a break across the Rhine, a promise that the war in Europe could be ended by Christmas. There were reports on the table that morning. Intelligence summaries noting German armored formations refitting near Arnhem. Panzer and SS units, not shattered remnants, but formations with tanks, artillery, and experienced crews. Montgomery had seen them. His staff had seen them. The information was not new. No changes were made. The timing remained fixed. The supply allocations remained unchanged. The route was not altered. The plan depended on speed, surprise, and uninterrupted movement along a single corridor. There would be no secondary axes, no fallback options. By signing off on the orders, Montgomery committed approximately 35,000 paratroopers, along with their glider-borne artillery and supplies, to land directly in an area where German resistance was known to exist. He accepted that they would be lightly armed, isolated, and dependent on rapid ground relief. Outside, the weather was clear. That mattered. Over 1,500 transport aircraft and more than 3,000 gliders were already assigned. Once airborne, the operation could not be recalled. The scale alone ensured momentum. Cancellation would be visible. Delay would be political. Montgomery framed the operation as decisive. Audacity was the central virtue. Speed would compensate for risk. The airborne divisions would become the spearhead. The armored column would become the linchpin. Everything depended on the plan unfolding exactly as written. This was the moment the decision became irreversible. Military judgment did not disappear in that room. It was present, documented, and understood. But it was subordinated to ambition, timetable, and visibility. The choice was made to proceed without adjustment. Operation Market Garden was set in motion. At the moment Montgomery committed the operation, the military opportunity appeared straightforward when reduced to numbers, terrain, and available force. The Allies possessed overwhelming material superiority in Western Europe. Air dominance was uncontested. Allied fighter bombers controlled the skies, and German air power was largely absent as an operational factor. Artillery, fuel, and armored formations were concentrated behind the front, ready for exploitation rather than attrition. The logistical base built since Normandy was intact and expanding. The airborne component of the plan was not experimental. Allied airborne forces had been used repeatedly since 1943. By September 1944, the American 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions were experienced formations. They had demonstrated the ability to seize defended objectives, disrupt enemy movement, and hold ground for limited periods when resistance was light or disorganized. British airborne doctrine emphasized methodical planning and disciplined defense around fixed objectives, particularly bridges. The terrain between Eindhoven and Arnhem, viewed abstractly, appeared favorable. The Netherlands offered relatively flat ground. Rivers and canals were obstacles, but they were predictable ones. Each bridge captured theoretically removed a major natural barrier. If bridges fell intact, armored units would not be forced into time-consuming river crossings under fire. In ideal conditions, this allowed mechanized forces to advance rapidly and continuously. The single highway that formed the operations axis was seen not as a liability, but as a simplification. A narrow frontage reduced command complexity. Concentration of force along one route maximized logistical efficiency, and allowed air support to focus on a defined corridor. If resistance was minimal, British armor could advance at speed, leapfrogging bridge to bridge while airborne troops secured the flanks. German forces, according to optimistic interpretations of intelligence, were in retreat. The collapse in France had been rapid and humiliating. Entire German formations had disintegrated weeks earlier. Equipment losses were severe. Morale was widely assumed to be low. The belief persisted that German units in the Netherlands were fragmented, understrength, and incapable of coordinated response. Within this framework, the opportunity appeared tangible. A coordinated airborne ground operation could outpace German recovery. Speed, not attrition, was the governing principle. If airborne troops seized bridges quickly and armor reached them within 48 hours, German forces would be denied the time needed to reorganize or counterattack effectively. Mechanized superiority reinforced this assumption. British armored divisions possessed numerical and qualitative advantages over most German units still operating in the West. Supported by artillery and air power, they were expected to overcome localized resistance quickly. Sherman tanks, while vulnerable in certain conditions, were effective in open terrain when used in mass and supported properly. From a purely military perspective, the obstacles were not theoretical impossibilities. Distance could be covered. Rivers could be crossed. Enemy formations could be fixed or bypassed. The operation did not require total destruction of German forces, only temporary paralysis along a narrow axis. The aim was penetration, not encirclement. The opportunity, however, was conditional. It depended on accurate intelligence interpretation, flexible execution, and terrain that allowed mechanized movement. It assumed that enemy forces near Arnhem were either negligible or slow to react. It assumed uninterrupted logistics along a single route. It assumed airborne units would face only light opposition during their holding period. Those conditions were not guaranteed. They were prerequisites. Militarily, the opportunity existed only if constraints imposed by terrain, enemy disposition, and timing were acknowledged and mitigated. Adjustments to drop zones, reinforcement schedules, or routes could have reduced exposure. Additional armor or alternate axes could have absorbed friction. But as the plan stood, the opportunity was narrowly defined and unforgiving. It offered high reward only under ideal execution. The margin for error was minimal. Any deviation would magnify risk exponentially. Montgomery chose to interpret the opportunity at its most optimistic edge. He treated assumptions as probabilities rather than contingencies. In doing so, he defined success as the absence of friction rather than the management of it. The opportunity was real. It was also fragile. In the days before the operation, the warning existed in written form, spoken form, and photographic detail. It was not vague. It was not speculative. It was specific, documented, and traceable. British airborne intelligence officers had been reviewing reconnaissance photographs taken by Allied aircraft flying over the Netherlands. The images showed armored vehicles parked in wooded areas near Arnhem. Tank silhouettes were visible. Track marks were fresh. Supply vehicles were present. These were not decoys. They were operational formations. Signals intelligence reinforced the visual evidence. Intercepts indicated the presence of 2 German armored divisions refitting after their withdrawal from France. These units were not retreating east in disorder. They were stationary, reorganizing, and receiving replacements. Their location placed them directly astride the northernmost objectives of the airborne plan. The assessment was compiled and circulated through the appropriate channels. It reached British Airborne Corps headquarters. It was presented to senior officers responsible for planning and execution. The conclusion was unambiguous. The area designated for the British 1st Airborne Division was not lightly held. The intelligence officer who pressed the issue did not do so emotionally. He did not speculate about disaster. He presented evidence, photographs, intercepts, reports from Dutch resistance networks that matched the aerial imagery. Multiple sources converged on the same conclusion. The warning did not argue against an airborne operation in principle. It argued for adjustment, a change in drop zones, a delay to allow enemy movement to be reassessed, additional armored support, a reconsideration of the assumption that airborne troops could hold Arnhem against mechanized counterattack. Parallel to this intelligence work, Montgomery's staff conducted what appeared to be thorough preparation. Weather forecasts were examined closely. Transport capacity was calculated to the aircraft. Glider loads were carefully balanced between artillery, engineers, and supplies. The airborne force was provisioned to sustain itself for a limited period without resupply. The plan assumed relief within 48 hours, and logistics were aligned to that expectation. From a procedural standpoint, the preparation was competent. Airborne doctrine was followed. Command relationships were defined. Timetables were synchronized. The planning staff did not neglect their duties. The flaw lay not in the mechanics of preparation, but in the interpretation of constraints. Terrain analysis acknowledged narrow roads and built-up areas, but these factors were not allowed to influence the core design. The single highway remained the sole axis of advance. Alternative routes were noted and dismissed as impractical rather than dangerous to ignore. Enemy disposition was treated as a variable that speed would neutralize. The presence of German armored units was acknowledged but discounted. They were described as refitting, understrength, and slow to react. The assumption was that airborne landings would dislocate command and delay any effective response. This interpretation required confidence in uninterrupted tempo. Any delay would give the enemy time to concentrate. Any failure at a bridge would halt the entire advance. The intelligence warning directly addressed this vulnerability. It identified precisely where delay would be most costly. The warning also challenged the idea that airborne forces could compensate for limited heavy weapons through aggression and morale alone. German armored units did not need to annihilate the paratroopers. They needed only to contain them. Time favored the defender once the element of surprise expired. Montgomery's planning culture emphasized control and certainty. He preferred set-piece operations where variables were minimized through preparation. In this case, preparation was extensive, but it was premised on assumptions that the intelligence directly contradicted. The credibility of the warning was rooted in method, not personality. It came from systematic analysis rather than intuition. It did not question Montgomery's authority. It questioned the permissive environment required for success. The response to the warning was administrative rather than analytical. The intelligence assessment was labeled pessimistic. The officer who raised it was characterized as lacking perspective. His insistence was reframed as emotional strain rather than professional judgment. By removing the warning from the decision-making process, the plan regained internal coherence. The assumptions no longer faced direct challenge. Preparation could proceed without structural revision. What remained was a plan that was internally logical but externally brittle. It functioned only if the environment conformed to expectation. The warning identified that it would not. The preparation demonstrated foresight within accepted boundaries. The warning demanded reconsideration of those boundaries. That demand was rejected. At that moment, the operation was no longer being shaped by intelligence. Intelligence was being shaped to fit the operation. The intervention that determined the outcome did not come as a single order. It emerged through pressure, silence, and institutional inertia. Montgomery did not face a formal veto. No superior explicitly canceled his plan. Instead, the system around him removed resistance until only affirmation remained. This was not accidental. It was structural. At the operational level, intelligence objections were neutralized early. Officers who challenged assumptions were sidelined rather than debated. Once the intelligence warning was reframed as excessive caution, it ceased to function as a constraint. The planning process reverted to confirmation rather than evaluation. Risk was acknowledged only insofar as it did not require redesign. Above Montgomery, Supreme Allied headquarters recognized the dangers. The reliance on a single road was understood. The dependence on perfect timing was obvious. Senior American commanders privately described the plan as brittle. But recognition did not translate into intervention. Dwight Eisenhower occupied a position defined less by command authority than by alliance management. His role was to hold together a coalition whose political foundations were fragile. British forces no longer represented the numerical core of the Allied armies in Europe, but British political influence remained disproportionate to that reality. Maintaining that balance was Eisenhower's primary obligation. Montgomery was not merely a field commander. He was a national symbol. His victories in North Africa had restored British confidence after years of defeat. His public standing in Britain was immense. Any visible rebuke carried political cost far beyond military calculation. Winston Churchill understood this dynamic and exploited it. He supported Montgomery consistently, not because the plan was sound, but because British leadership required visible strategic initiative. The prospect of a decisive British-led thrust into Germany appealed directly to political narrative. It suggested parity with American forces whose advances were dominating headlines. Churchill's support did not take the form of operational argument. It took the form of pressure. Eisenhower was reminded that alliance unity depended on respecting British strategic priorities. Denying Montgomery his operation risked reopening disputes over command structure, resource allocation, and post-war influence. The combined chiefs of staff structure reinforced this constraint. Major strategic decisions required consensus. Consensus required accommodation. Montgomery understood this and used it. He framed Market Garden as an opportunity that could not be delayed without losing momentum. Delay became synonymous with timidity. Opposition became obstruction. Institutionally, the plan benefited from momentum. Resources had already been allocated. Aircraft scheduled. Units assigned. Canceling or modifying the operation would have required visible acknowledgement of doubt. That acknowledgement would have rippled outward, raising questions about leadership confidence and strategic direction. There was also calculation. Eisenhower knew that approving the plan carried two possible outcomes. If it succeeded, the war might indeed end sooner. The political dividends would be enormous. If it failed, Montgomery's credibility would be damaged. His persistent criticism of Allied strategy would be muted. Either result appeared manageable. What Eisenhower did not do was impose conditions. He did not require alternate routes. He did not mandate adjustments to drop zones. He did not insist on increased armored reserves for Arnhem. Approval was given without modification, effectively transferring responsibility downward while preserving alliance harmony upward. Within Montgomery's own headquarters, dissent was discouraged by example. Once it became clear that higher authority would not intervene, staff officers adapted. Planning focused on execution, not reassessment. The system rewarded compliance. The plan hardened. This process did not require conspiracy. It required alignment of incentives. Montgomery wanted decisive command and visibility. Churchill wanted British prominence. Eisenhower wanted coalition stability. Each objective was individually rational. Collectively, they eliminated the space for operational caution. The language surrounding the decision reflected this. Risks were described as manageable. Intelligence was described as uncertain. Terrain challenges were described as solvable through speed. None of these statements were false in isolation. Together, they created a narrative that displaced probability with optimism. The critical overrule was not a shouted order or a signed memorandum. It was the quiet decision not to interfere. Political authority chose not to restrain military ambition. Institutional structure absorbed warning and returned reassurance. Once approval was granted, the plan became insulated. Revisiting assumptions would have implied that approval itself was flawed. No one at the top was incentivized to reopen the question. By the time aircraft engines were warming on British airfields, the decision no longer belonged to any individual. It belonged to the system that had carried it forward unchanged. Operational caution had not been disproven. It had been rendered irrelevant. The plan advanced not because it was the safest option, but because it satisfied political needs, preserved institutional balance, and promised symbolic victory. Military logic was present throughout the process, but it was constrained, deferred, and ultimately overruled. The machinery of alliance warfare had done its work. When the first aircraft crossed the Dutch coast, the consequences of the decision were already locked in. The plan had no elasticity. It required momentum from the first hour, and momentum began to fracture almost immediately. Initial landings succeeded in part. American airborne units secured several of their assigned objectives. Bridges near Eindhoven and Nijmegen were taken after hard fighting. These actions created the appearance of validation. Reports sent back to headquarters emphasized progress. The narrative of speed remained intact. North of Nijmegen, the situation diverged sharply from expectation. British airborne units approaching Arnhem encountered organized resistance almost from the outset. German forces were not scattered remnants. They were coordinated, mobile, and aggressive. Armored elements moved faster than anticipated. Command and control functioned despite the disruption of airborne landings. The British 1st Airborne Division was spread thin by design. Drop zones were located several miles from the Arnhem Bridge to reduce exposure to anti-aircraft fire. This distance was acceptable only if resistance was light. It was not. German units occupied key road junctions and urban approaches, fragmenting airborne movement before consolidation could occur. Small unit actions multiplied. Paratroopers advanced through built-up areas and wooded terrain that restricted visibility and maneuver. Light infantry weapons were sufficient for delaying actions, not for sustained defense against armor. Anti-tank weapons were limited. Ammunition expenditure increased rapidly. As hours turned into days, the fundamental vulnerability became apparent. The airborne troops were fixed. They could not maneuver freely. Their mission required them to hold specific ground regardless of cost. The German response exploited this rigidity. Rather than seeking decisive engagement, German commanders isolated pockets, contained them, and applied pressure incrementally. South of Arnhem, the armored relief force encountered its own constraints. The single highway proved exactly as narrow and exposed as intelligence had warned. Vehicles advanced in column, unable to disperse. Any obstruction halted movement entirely. Destroyed vehicles could not be bypassed. Engineers worked under fire to clear the road, while German forces targeted choke points deliberately. The surrounding terrain nullified mechanized advantage. Ditches, embankments, and soft ground prevented off-road movement. Tanks that attempted to leave the roadway became immobilized. German infantry used this predictability to establish ambush positions along the corridor. Delays accumulated. Each delay amplified the next. Time lost south of Nijmegen translated directly into isolation at Arnhem. The assumption that airborne units could hold for 48 hours became irrelevant as relief timelines slipped beyond that threshold. Communications compounded the problem. Airborne radios failed to function reliably over distance and terrain. Units operated with incomplete situational awareness. Requests for resupply and reinforcement were delayed or misdirected. Coordination between airborne forces and advancing armor was episodic at best. Resupply by air proved inadequate. Drop zones were contested. Supplies fell into German hands or landed beyond reach. What reached the paratroopers was insufficient to sustain prolonged engagement. Food, medical supplies, and ammunition dwindled. German counterattacks increased in intensity as days passed. Armor was employed selectively, supported by infantry familiar with the terrain. Buildings were reduced methodically. Defensive positions were overrun one by one. British airborne units fought effectively within their limitations, but effectiveness did not alter the strategic reality. At Arnhem, the airborne force did not fail tactically. It was consumed operationally. It was asked to hold against a threat it was not designed to defeat. Courage and discipline extended resistance, but they could not replace heavy weapons or mobility. The armored relief column never arrived in time. Its advance was measured in miles per day rather than hours. Each bridge captured further south required consolidation before movement could continue. The corridor functioned as a funnel, feeding men and machines into a constrained battle space where initiative belonged to the defender. Attempts to improvise emerged too late. Tanks were modified with makeshift cutting devices to breach obstacles. These adaptations addressed symptoms, not causes. They reflected recognition of error without the ability to reverse it. By the 9th day, the outcome was no longer in doubt. British airborne survivors at Arnhem were exhausted, undersupplied, and surrounded. Withdrawal was authorized not as a maneuver, but as a necessity. Those who escaped did so under cover of darkness. Most did not escape. The casualty figures reflected the scale of miscalculation. Tens of thousands of Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured across the operation. The British 1st Airborne Division ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. American airborne units suffered heavy losses that could not be justified by territorial gain. The strategic objective vanished. The Rhine was not crossed. Germany was not breached. The promised corridor into the heart of the Reich did not materialize. Instead, the front stabilized. Momentum dissipated. The consequences extended beyond the battlefield. Supplies diverted to Market Garden were unavailable elsewhere. Other Allied advances slowed. German forces were granted time to regroup, fortify defensive lines, and prepare for future operations. The failure also exposed structural weaknesses in Allied command. Coordination across national lines proved fragile under stress. Responsibility for failure diffused upward and outward, avoiding direct accountability. Explanations focused on weather, chance, and friction rather than design. None of these consequences were unforeseeable. Each traced back to the original decision to proceed without adjustment. The single highway became a constraint exactly as predicted. The presence of German armored units near Arnhem became decisive exactly as warned. The dependence on perfect timing became fatal when timing slipped. The battlefield did not judge intent. It measured capability against reality. The reality was that airborne forces had been placed in a role that demanded endurance against mechanized opposition without relief. The reality was that armor had been committed to a route that offered no redundancy. The reality was that speed had been substituted for resilience. Market Garden did not collapse in a single moment. It eroded steadily as assumptions met resistance. Each hour revealed another layer of vulnerability. Each loss compounded the original error. By the time the operation was terminated, the decision that shaped it could no longer be separated from its effects. The cost was paid not in reputations or political standing, but in casualties and lost opportunity. The operation that was meant to end the war by Christmas instead demonstrated the limits of ambition when divorced from constraint. The consequences were written across the Dutch landscape in burned vehicles, abandoned equipment, and empty drop zones. The battlefield had responded exactly as the warning predicted. In the post-war record, the operation was examined without urgency and without illusion. Time removed the need to defend decisions made under pressure. Documents were declassified. Diaries were published. Official histories were written with the outcome already fixed. The British 1st Airborne Division was listed as effectively destroyed. Of roughly 10,000 men committed at Arnhem, fewer than a quarter returned across the Rhine. The remainder were killed, wounded, or captured. Unit rosters recorded entire companies erased in place. Command structures ceased to function beyond the lowest levels during the final days. Allied casualty totals exceeded 17,000 across the operation. These figures were not disputed in post-war assessments. What was debated was responsibility. Official British histories described the operation as bold but unlucky. Weather, communication failures, and unexpected resistance were emphasized. The language softened causation. Failure was attributed to friction rather than design. The core assumptions of the plan were rarely addressed directly. American post-war analyses were more explicit. Staff studies conducted by the U.S. Army highlighted the structural vulnerability of relying on a single axis of advance. They noted that the operation violated principles of redundancy and maneuver. Intelligence assessments were cited that had identified German armored formations near Arnhem prior to the landings. Memoirs from senior commanders confirmed what wartime correspondents had implied. Dwight Eisenhower acknowledged that the plan carried unacceptable risk. He admitted that political considerations influenced approval. Maintaining alliance cohesion outweighed imposing stricter operational constraints. Omar Bradley's recollections were blunt. He described the operation as strategically unnecessary and operationally fragile. He noted that American airborne divisions were placed under British command for a plan they had not designed and could not influence. His criticism remained measured, but the implication was clear. British commanders involved in planning defended the execution rather than the concept. Failures were compartmentalized. Responsibility was dispersed. No single corrective action was identified because acknowledging such an action would have required acknowledging that the original decision was flawed. Intelligence officers who had raised warnings were vindicated quietly. Their assessments aligned with post-war findings. The presence of German armored units near Arnhem was no longer contested. Their ability to respond rapidly was no longer minimized. What had been dismissed as pessimism became accepted fact. No court of inquiry was convened with the authority to assign accountability. There were no formal reprimands tied directly to the decision. Montgomery retained command. His reputation suffered among Allied officers, but not within British political leadership. The system that had enabled the decision also absorbed its consequences. Strategically, the failure altered the tempo of the war. The Rhine remained uncrossed for months. German forces used the respite to strengthen defensive positions. Subsequent Allied operations faced stiffer resistance than would have existed had German recovery been denied. Market Garden did not prolong the war dramatically, but it removed the possibility of shortening it. That distinction mattered in hindsight. The opportunity cost became more apparent as casualty lists from later operations accumulated. Post-war military education treated Market Garden as a case study, not in bravery or sacrifice, but in decision-making under constraint. The focus shifted away from airborne tactics and toward command structure, intelligence integration, and alliance politics. What emerged consistently across records was not a mystery of chance, but a pattern of choice. The warnings were present. The risks were understood. The consequences aligned with those risks. The decision-making process insulated itself from correction. Political necessity overrode operational adjustment. Once approved, the plan could not be altered without political consequence. That dynamic, more than any German action, defined the outcome. The post-war record did not reveal new enemies or hidden failures. It confirmed what had already been visible in September 1944. The operation failed because it was designed to succeed only under conditions that did not exist. In hindsight, Market Garden required no reinterpretation. The documents closed the case. The decision was foreseeable in its risk. The outcome was foreseeable in its cost. The link between them was direct. History did not soften that connection. It clarified it. The decision that defined Operation Market Garden was not made on the battlefield. It was made in a headquarters room where ambition, alliance politics, and institutional caution converged. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery chose to proceed without adjustment. Intelligence warning of German armored strength near Arnhem was acknowledged and dismissed. Terrain constraints were recognized and accepted as manageable. The plan was allowed to harden around assumptions that required perfect execution. Those assumptions failed. The airborne forces were not misused tactically. They performed within the limits imposed upon them. They were asked to hold fixed objectives against mechanized opposition without timely relief. That requirement exceeded their design. Their losses were the consequence of assignment, not execution. The armored relief force did not fail in courage or effort. It was committed to a route that allowed no flexibility. Delay was inevitable. Once delay occurred, the operation collapsed by design. Political considerations shielded the decision from correction. Alliance cohesion took precedence over operational revision. Authority existed to impose conditions. It was not exercised. Approval was given without restraint. The outcome followed directly. 17,000 Allied casualties were recorded. The British 1st Airborne Division ceased to function as a fighting force. No strategic breakthrough was achieved. The Rhine remained uncrossed. The war did not end by Christmas. Post-war records confirm that the risks were known in advance. The warnings were specific. The consequences matched those warnings precisely. No hidden factor intervened. No unforeseeable event altered the trajectory. Responsibility diffused upward and outward. No formal accountability followed. The system that enabled the decision absorbed the failure and moved on. This case is closed. Market Garden failed because audacity was permitted to override constraint. Speed was substituted for resilience. Political visibility was prioritized over operational reality. The battlefield enforced the correction. The decision stands as it was made. The outcome stands as it occurred. If you want to examine more command decisions where ambition outpaced judgment and soldiers paid the price, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.